A smile can hide a very sharp secret. I'm Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
The village hall of St. Mary Mead had never looked more festive, draped as it was in bunting left over from the coronation and filled with the cheerful buzz of an afternoon's entertainment. The Women's Institute had outdone themselves organizing the mock Assizes, a fundraising event that promised to let neighbors playfully accuse each other of minor transgressions, while Inspector Slack, borrowed from the county station for the afternoon, presided with borrowed judicial robes and barely concealed amusement. Miss Jane Marple sat in the third row, her knitting needles moving with their familiar gentle rhythm as she worked on what appeared to be a pale blue jumper. To the casual observer, she seemed entirely absorbed in her stitches, but her soft eyes missed nothing of the drama unfolding around her. The mock courtroom had been arranged with surprising attention to detail. A proper witness box, constructed from old church pews, a jury of 12 villagers, including Colonel Melchett and Mrs. Price-Ridley, and even a small table bearing the ceremonial mace borrowed from the town council. Inspector Slack, looking rather grand in his horsehair wig despite his natural skepticism about village theatricals, rapped his gavel with evident satisfaction. Ladies and gentlemen, we shall now hear the case of the missing church silver, brought by Mrs. Hartnell against person or persons unknown. A ripple of delighted laughter ran through the audience, for everyone knew the silver had simply been mislaid during the Easter cleaning and found 3 days later in the vestry cupboard. The afternoon's entertainment had been carefully planned by Mrs. Dolly Bantry, whose organizational skills were matched only by her enthusiasm for village life. She moved between the rows of chairs, ensuring everyone had their programs and that the refreshment table remained well stocked with her famous lemon tarts and elderflower cordial. Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Bantry's eyes sparkled with genuine pleasure at bringing the community together, though there was perhaps a slight tension in her shoulders that suggested the event's success mattered more to her than she let on. Dr. Haydock had been pressed into service as the court clerk, reading charges with mock solemnity that couldn't quite hide his natural good humor. The defendant is accused of borrowing without permission, failing to return promptly, and causing considerable inconvenience to the flower arranging committee. More laughter, and even Inspector Slack's stern expression cracked slightly. The first witness, young Lucy Ilesbarrow, who helped at the vicarage, took the stand with becoming modesty. Miss Marple's needles paused, almost imperceptibly as she observed the girl's hands trembling slightly as she swore the oath on Mrs. Bantry's family Bible. Nerves, perhaps, or something more interesting. In Miss Marple's long experience, people were rarely nervous about things that didn't matter to them. As the mock proceedings continued, Miss Marple found herself studying the assembled villagers with her usual gentle attention to detail. There was something particularly animated about the way people were entering into the spirit of the thing, as if the pretense of accusation and defense allowed them to say things they might not otherwise voice. Mrs. Price-Ridley, serving as jury foreman, seemed to relish her temporary authority rather more than was strictly necessary for amateur theatricals. The turning point came when Mrs. Bantry herself took the witness stand, called to testify about the church cleaning schedule. She had just begun to speak, her voice clear and confident, when she reached for the glass of elderflower cordial that had been placed thoughtfully beside the witness box. "I can confirm that the silver was perfectly secure when I locked the vestry on Wednesday evening," she began, raising the glass to her lips with the unconscious grace of someone accustomed to public speaking. The change was swift and terrible. Mrs. Bantry's words died mid-sentence as her face contorted in sudden, unmistakable distress. The glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the wooden floor of the makeshift courtroom as she clutched at her throat. Inspector Slack was on his feet instantly, his theatrical role forgotten, but it was too late. Mrs. Bantry collapsed forward across the witness box rail, her carefully arranged hair spilling over the polished wood like golden silk. The silence that followed was complete and awful, broken only by the sound of elderflower, cordial dripping steadily from the witness stand to pool among the glass shards below. Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten in her lap as she watched Inspector Slack bend over the motionless figure, his face grim with the knowledge that his afternoon of playful justice had become something far more serious indeed. The first sound to pierce the awful silence was Dr. Haydock's sharp intake of breath as he knelt beside Mrs. Bantry's motionless form. His medical bag, never far from reach even at village entertainments, snapped open with practiced efficiency. Miss Marple watched his hands move with professional certainty, checking pulse points and examining Mrs. Bantry's face with the grim concentration she had seen him employ during the influenza outbreak 3 winters past. "I'm afraid she's gone," Dr. Haydock announced quietly, his voice carrying the weight of finality that silenced even Mrs. Price-Ridley's rising hysteria. He looked up at Inspector Slack with unmistakable gravity. "The symptoms suggest cyanide poisoning, though I'll need proper laboratory confirmation. The bitter almond scent is faint but distinctive, and the rapidity of onset." He shook his head sadly. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were about. Inspector Slack straightened slowly, the borrowed judicial robes suddenly seeming grotesquely inappropriate. Miss Marple observed his transformation with interest, watching the village entertainer disappear entirely as the sharp-eyed policeman she knew him to be took command. "Right then," he said, his voice cutting through the shocked murmurs. "This hall is now a crime scene. No one leaves until I've spoken with each of you personally." The elderflower cordial continued its steady drip from the witness stand, and Miss Marple found herself studying the shattered glass with considerable attention. The fragments had scattered in a very particular pattern, she noted, most falling toward the audience rather than behind the witness box. This suggested Mrs. Bantry had gripped the glass quite firmly when the poison took effect, rather than simply dropping it from surprise. More interesting still was the small square of damask that had been folded with domestic precision beneath where the glass had sat, leaving a ghostly impression on the polished wood. Someone had taken considerable care with that placement. "But surely this must be some dreadful accident," protested Mrs. Price-Ridley, fanning herself vigorously with her program. Dear Dolly hadn't an enemy in the world. Everyone simply adored her. A murmur of agreement rose from several villagers, though Miss Marple noticed that not everyone joined in with equal enthusiasm. Young Lucy Isles Barrow remained pressed against the wall, her face pale as parchment, while Colonel Melchett had positioned himself near the doors with military precision, preventing anyone from leaving without appearing to do so deliberately. The girl's hands, Miss Marple observed, showed the telltale dampness of nervous perspiration, and her eyes kept darting between the witness stand and the refreshment table with an expression that contained more guilt than grief. "I always said that elderflower cordial had an odd taste," declared old Mr. Petherick, conveniently forgetting that he had consumed 3 glasses himself during the afternoon's festivities. Perhaps it was meant for someone else entirely. Mrs. Bantry did have words with young Timothy about the gardening, offered Mrs. Clement hesitantly. And there was that business with Mr. Redding over the property boundary, though I can hardly imagine either of them. Her voice trailed off as the implications settled over the assembled neighbors like a cold fog. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as theories multiplied around her like dandelions after rain. She noticed how quickly friendships dissolved under suspicion's harsh light, how neighbors who had been laughing together moments before now studied each other with wary calculation. The mock trial's playful accusations had been replaced by something far more sinister, and the cozy certainty of village life lay shattered as thoroughly as the glass on the floor. Dr. Haydock was carefully examining the remaining cordial, using his handkerchief to avoid contamination. "The decanter appears untouched," he murmured to Inspector Slack, "which suggests the poison was added directly to Mrs. Bantry's glass, rather than the general supply." Inspector Slack nodded grimly, his eyes sweeping the assembled villagers with professional assessment. A young constable arrived breathlessly, bicycle clips still adorning his trousers, and was immediately dispatched to secure all entrances and ensure nothing was disturbed. "Someone in this room is a murderer," Inspector Slack announced, his words falling like stones into still water. "And I intend to discover who." The festive bunting now seemed macabre against the hall's transformed atmosphere, while Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, her mild blue eyes missing nothing of the fear, guilt, and desperate calculation playing across familiar faces. The afternoon's entertainment had become something far more deadly, and she suspected the real drama was only just beginning. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as Inspector Slack positioned himself behind the refreshment table, transforming Mrs. Bantry's carefully arranged spread into an impromptu interrogation station. The inspector's theatrical robes had been hastily removed, replaced by the sharp efficiency of a man who understood that murder waited for no one's convenience. "Miss Islesbarrow," he called first, his voice cutting through the hall's oppressive silence. "You prepared Mrs. Bantry's glass. Tell me exactly what you did." Lucy stepped forward on unsteady legs, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. "I filled it fresh from the decanter just before she took the stand, sir. She asked for it particularly," said speaking made her throat dry. The girl's voice barely rose above a whisper. "I used the best crystal glass, the one with the little roses etched round the rim, and placed it on the damask square so it wouldn't mark the wood." Miss Marple observed how Lucy's left hand kept touching her pocket, a gesture that spoke of something weighing heavily on her conscience. More interesting still was the way the girl's eyes kept returning to the shattered remains, as if drawn by some terrible fascination. "And the timing," Inspector Slack pressed, pencil poised over his notebook. "Perhaps 5 minutes before she drank, sir. She was called to testify. Then there was the business with the oath. She'd only just begun speaking when—" Lucy's voice caught, unable to finish. Dr. Haydock stepped forward, his medical authority lending weight to his words. "Inspector, cyanide acts within minutes, sometimes seconds. Whoever administered it needed access to Mrs. Bantry's glass very close to when she consumed it." "Precisely," Slack agreed grimly. "Who else approached the refreshment table during those crucial minutes?" A chorus of nervous voices provided answers. Mr. Redding had come for another sandwich. Mrs. Clement had been tidying napkins. Colonel Melchett had refilled his teacup. Each admission seemed to widen the circle of suspicion rather than narrow it. Miss Marple's attention, however, was drawn to Mrs. Price-Ridley and Colonel Melchett, who had withdrawn to a corner for what appeared to be an urgent, whispered conversation. Mrs. Price-Ridley's face bore an expression that seemed to blend fear with a peculiar proprietorial indignation, as if the murder had somehow offended her sense of social order. Colonel Melchett, usually so composed, kept stroking his moustache with visible agitation. "Mr. Redding," Inspector Slack continued, "you mentioned having words with Mrs. Bantry recently about boundary lines. Perhaps you'd care to elaborate?" The younger man's face reddened. "It was nothing serious, Inspector. A dispute over hedge trimming. Mrs. Bantry felt I'd been too aggressive with the privet, and I thought she was being unreasonable about a few inches. Hardly worth murdering someone over." "People have killed for less," Slack observed dryly. Miss Marple found herself studying the witness stand with renewed interest. The damask square beneath where the glass had sat bore a very particular watermark when held to the light, and she noticed something else that made her needles pause entirely. Near where Mrs. Bantry's head had fallen, a tiny thread clung to a raised splinter in the wooden rail, pale as the down from a handkerchief corner. The positioning suggested someone had leaned very close to the witness box, close enough for fabric to catch on the wood. "Mrs. Price-Ridley," Inspector Slack called, interrupting her whispered conference with the colonel. "You were serving on the jury. What did you observe?" Mrs. Price-Ridley drew herself up with considerable dignity, though Miss Marple noticed a slight flush in her cheeks. "I was focused on my duties as foreman, Inspector. Though I must say, I did notice Colonel Melchett and I were discussing the proper pronunciation of Assizes near the cordial decanter just before poor Dolly took the stand." Colonel Melchett straightened indignantly. Surely you don't suspect me of poisoning poor Dolly over a pronunciation dispute. At this stage, Colonel, I suspect everyone and no one, Inspector Slack replied with diplomatic firmness. Miss Marple's mild blue eyes missed nothing of the fear and calculation playing across familiar faces. The pattern of the elderflower cordial's splash suggested the glass had been positioned with deliberate care, and she had noticed something else that troubled her greatly. The damask square was folded with domestic precision, corners aligned as only someone trained in proper housekeeping would manage. Yet the hall's own linen was stored haphazardly, often with frayed edges. This piece bore the telltale weave of fine household goods, familiar in the way that things from established homes become familiar after many committee meetings. Someone wanted Mrs. Bantry to reach for that specific glass, Miss Marple murmured to herself, her knitting forgotten in her lap. In her long experience, beloved people often made the most surprising enemies, precisely because their goodness threw others' failings into sharp relief. The question was not who might have disliked Mrs. Bantry, but who might have been threatened by her continued presence in their carefully constructed lives. The afternoon's mock trial had become something far more sinister, and the real drama was only just beginning. Inspector Slack's methodical nature asserted itself as he began organizing the chaos into manageable lines of inquiry. The young constable returned from his circuit of the building, breathless with discovery. "Sir, I found this in the dustbin behind the hall," he announced, holding up a small brown medicine bottle with obvious pride in his thoroughness. Dr. Haydock examined the bottle with professional interest, using his handkerchief to avoid contamination. "Potassium cyanide," he confirmed after a cautious inspection of the white residue clinging to the interior. "More than enough to accomplish what we've witnessed here today." His grave expression left no doubt about the bottle's significance. The discovery sent a visible shiver through the assembled villagers, transforming abstract fear into concrete reality. Someone among them had not only planned Mrs. Bantry's death, but had disposed of the evidence with calculated efficiency, assuming the afternoon's entertainment would provide perfect cover for their crime. "Now then," Inspector Slack continued, his notebook at the ready, "who among you has legitimate access to such substances?" His gaze swept the familiar faces with renewed intensity. "Dr. Haydock, obviously, but he's been in full view throughout the afternoon. Anyone else work with chemicals or have medical training?" The silence stretched uncomfortably until Mrs. Clement raised a trembling hand. "I help at the chemist's shop on Thursdays," she admitted with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Petherick sometimes asks me to assist with inventory and the preparation of medicinal compounds." Old Mr. Petherick nodded confirmation, though his expression suggested he wished circumstances were different. "Mrs. Clement has been most helpful with the dangerous substances cabinet, quite knowledgeable about proper storage and handling procedures." Miss Marple observed how this admission seemed to provide relief to several other villagers, their shoulders relaxing as suspicion appeared to settle elsewhere. Yet something about Mrs. Clement's demeanor troubled her. The woman's fear seemed genuine enough, but there was something almost rehearsed about her confession, as if she were offering herself as a convenient sacrifice. "Mrs. Clement," Inspector Slack pressed, "when did you last handle potassium cyanide?" 2 weeks ago, perhaps 3. We were reorganizing the dangerous substances cabinet, ensuring proper labeling." Her voice grew steadier as she spoke, finding comfort in routine details. "Mr. Petherick is very particular about such things." Meanwhile, the constable had continued his methodical search and emerged from behind the stage curtain with another discovery. "Found this paper twist near the back entrance, sir. Still has that bitter almond smell." Dr. Haydock examined it carefully. "This would have held a sufficient quantity," he confirmed grimly. "Someone came prepared." Miss Marple's attention, however, remained fixed on the witness stand and the carefully folded damask square beneath where Mrs. Bantry's glass had sat. The corners were tucked with domestic precision, aligned as only someone trained in proper housekeeping would manage. More telling still was the faint scent of lavender that clung to the fabric, Not the bottled sort, but the old-fashioned sachets favored by established households. "Mr. Redding," Inspector Slack called, turning his attention to the obvious suspect. "This boundary dispute with Mrs. Bantry. Perhaps it was more serious than you initially suggested?" Mr. Redding's face flushed deeply. "It was nothing worth killing over, Inspector. A few inches of hedge, a misplaced fence post. We'd even arranged to discuss it further next week. She offered me some of her prize-winning gooseberry jam as a peace offering." He gestured toward the refreshment table where jars of homemade preserves stood untouched. "Yet you admit to being near the refreshment table just before Mrs. Bantry drank," Slack observed coldly. "I took a sandwich. I saw Lucy place the glass. I helped myself to cheese and pickle, and I returned to my seat. I never touched that glass or the cordial." Dr. Haydock had been conducting a more thorough examination of Mrs. Bantry's person and now looked up with another significant observation. "Inspector, there are traces of face powder on Mrs. Bantry's fingernails, quite fresh. She must have handled something dusted with cosmetics very recently before her death." This observation sent an uncomfortable ripple through the assembled women, each unconsciously checking their own powder compacts. Miss Marple noted how several pairs of eyes immediately went to Mrs. Price-Ridley, whose generous application of face powder was legendary throughout St. Mary Mead. Young Lucy Ilesbarrow had grown progressively paler during these exchanges, her hand returning repeatedly to her pocket where something rectangular pressed against the fabric. Miss Marple's gentle blue eyes missed nothing of the girl's distress, which seemed to contain more guilt than grief. Inspector Slack's decisive nature finally asserted itself. "Mrs. Clement, I'm afraid you'll need to come to the station. Your access to the poison and proximity to the victim make you our primary suspect." Two constables stepped forward to escort the quietly dignified woman, who accepted her fate with resigned grace. Yet Miss Marple remained troubled by details that didn't quite align. The careful placement of the damask square, the thread caught on the witness box, the timing of the poison's administration, all suggested a mind that planned with domestic precision rather than chemical knowledge. In her long experience, the most obvious suspect was often the most convenient, not necessarily the most correct. As the constables led Mrs. Clement away with quiet dignity, a palpable sense of relief settled over the village hall like dust after a storm. The assembled villagers seemed to exhale collectively, their shoulders relaxing as suspicion found what appeared to be its proper target. Inspector Slack busied himself with organizing statements and evidence, his notebook filling with the methodical details that would satisfy his superiors back at the county station. Miss Marple, however, remained in her chair, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm while her mild blue eyes continued their careful observation. In her long experience, the most convenient solution was often the most dangerous, particularly when it allowed everyone else to feel comfortable again. The eager acceptance of Mrs. Clement's guilt troubled her almost as much as the crime itself. "If I might, Inspector," she said gently, rising with the careful movements of someone who understood that haste often obscured important details. "I believe I left my shawl in the cloakroom. Would it be possible to retrieve it?" Inspector Slack, absorbed in his paperwork, waved absent permission without truly seeing her. Miss Marple made her way to the small passage behind the stage, where the familiar scent of furniture polish and old programs lingered in the air. Her shawl hung precisely where she had left it, but her attention was drawn to the linen cupboard, standing slightly ajar. The shelves revealed the usual collection of village hall supplies, coarse cotton tea towels and mismatched napkins that spoke of years of church bazaars and committee meetings. Yet among these humble fabrics lay something quite different. 4 squares of fine damask, folded with the crisp domestic precision she had noticed earlier. The quality was unmistakable. Irish linen with hand-finished edges, the sort found in established households where such things mattered. More telling still was the faint perfume that clung to the fabric, not the bottled lavender of shops, but the gentle ghost of sachets tucked into drawers for years. Miss Marple lifted one corner with careful fingers, and there, nearly worn away by countless careful launderings, pale embroidery revealed itself in the light, a modest P entwined with an R. She folded the cloth back exactly as she had found it and closed the cupboard without sound. Returning to the hall, she found young Lucy Islesbarrow hovering near the refreshment table, her face bearing the particular pallor of someone wrestling with conscience. When the girl saw Miss Marple approach, she moved closer with the desperate courage of youth facing an impossible decision. "Miss Marple," Lucy whispered urgently, "I ought to say something before it becomes worse in the telling. Mrs. Price-Ridley told me to make it look proper before Mrs. Bantry spoke. She said the witness stand must be becoming and insisted I use one of the nicer squares she had brought specially. I thought it would please Mrs. Bantry. Truly I did." Miss Marple's expression remained gently encouraging. "Of course you did, dear. One hardly ever means harm." Lucy's hand went to her pocket as if drawn by invisible strings. "There's something else." She glanced around nervously before producing a small gold compact, the sort sold in better shops, perhaps a decade earlier. "I found this on the floor just after. When everyone rushed forward, I picked it up before anyone could step on it." She opened it with guilty fingers, revealing a puff thick with powder and, along the hinge, a smear that had clotted as if the compact had been closed too hastily. Miss Marple accepted the compact and, quite accidentally, breathed in its scent. Beneath the familiar notes of orris root and talc, something else lingered, the faintest thread of bitterness that spoke of substances that had no place in a lady's powder compact. She had raised geraniums long enough to know the difference between sweet and merely perfumed. Dr. Haydock, passing nearby, paused when he noticed their quiet conference. "If that belongs to anyone, best say so now," he advised with professional concern. "Inspector Slack will not be pleased to learn evidence was pocketed." "It was on the floor near the witness box," Lucy repeated, her flush deepening. "I thought to return it later when things were calmer." Miss Marple closed the compact gently and pressed it back into Lucy's hands. "Keep it safe for now, dear. Best not let it wander again." She turned to Dr. Haydock with her characteristic mildness. "Doctor, you mentioned earlier about the poisons application. Could you elaborate?" Dr. Haydock glanced around, then spoke quietly. "Between ourselves, Jane, the decanter tests clean to my nose. No bitterness in the bulk supply. If it was cyanide, and I'm nearly certain it was, I'd wager it was applied to the rim of the glass or mixed with just the first mouthful. Something very localized." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And poor Dolly did always take her first sip with such precision. She would never have been careless with good crystal." Across the hall, Mrs. Price-Ridley was giving her statement to Inspector Slack with considerable dignity, though Miss Marple noticed a slight agitation in her manner. The woman had removed one glove, and the remaining crochet work showed a telltale unraveling at the wrist. Miss Marple's mind, which stored correspondences as carefully as other women stored recipes, aligned this observation with the pale thread she had noticed caught on the witness box rail earlier. The pattern was becoming clearer, though she kept her thoughts to herself. The careful placement of the damask square, the compact with its telltale bitter residue, the thread that spoke of someone leaning very close to the witness stand, all suggested a mind that planned with domestic precision rather than chemical knowledge. In her experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those who applied their ordinary skills to extraordinary purposes. Inspector Slack's voice carried across the hall as he addressed the remaining villagers. "I believe we have our case well in hand. Mrs. Clement had means, opportunity, and access to the poison. The evidence speaks for itself." Miss Marple continued her gentle knitting, each stitch as measured as her thoughts. The evidence did indeed speak, but perhaps not in the language Inspector Slack was prepared to hear. Village life, as she had learned through decades of careful observation, was rarely as straightforward as official investigations preferred. The real drama, she suspected, was only beginning to unfold, and the most important revelations were yet to come. The afternoon light was beginning to fade through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the hall where Mrs. Bantry had met her end. Miss Marple watched these shadows with the patience of someone who understood that truth, like good embroidery, revealed itself only to those willing to examine each thread with proper care. The evening shadows lengthened across the village hall as Inspector Slack completed his preliminary interviews, his satisfaction with Mrs. Clement's arrest evident in his brisk movements. Miss Marple remained in her corner chair, knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm while her mild blue eyes continued their careful observations. The departure of the obvious suspect had done little to ease the tension among the remaining villagers, and she found their nervous energy far more revealing than their earlier shock. Mrs. Price-Ridley lingered near the refreshment table, her usual commanding presence diminished by frequent dabbing at her forehead with a lace handkerchief. Her eyes darted repeatedly toward the witness stand, then away, as if the sight caused her physical discomfort. More telling still was the way she kept adjusting her sleeve, attempting to conceal the unraveling thread in her crochet work that Miss Marple had noticed earlier. Young Lucy Eyeless Barrow approached with the hesitant steps of someone wrestling with conscience. "Miss Marple," she whispered urgently, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "I must tell someone about the compact. It wasn't just lying on the floor, as I said. I saw Mrs. Price-Ridley drop it when she rushed forward after Mrs. Bantry collapsed." Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. "Indeed, dear." She seemed quite frantic afterward, looking about on the floor as if searching for something important. When she couldn't find it, she looked positively cross, as if someone had deliberately hidden it from her. Lucy's voice dropped even lower. "I think she was looking for this." She touched her pocket where the compact rested. Dr. Haydock, who had been quietly observing Inspector Slack's methods, approached their corner with the measured steps of someone who had reached troubling conclusions. "Miss Marple, I've been considering the poison's application more carefully. The localized effect suggests someone with intimate knowledge of Mrs. Bantry's habits, how she always took that first ceremonial sip, where exactly to place the poison for maximum effect." "Quite so, Doctor. Someone who had observed her closely over many years." "Precisely. This wasn't the work of someone with mere access to chemicals. This required personal familiarity with the victim's behavior patterns." Dr. Haydock's expression grew grimmer. Mrs. Clement, working occasionally at the chemist's shop, would hardly have such detailed knowledge of Mrs. Bantry's drinking habits. Their quiet conference was interrupted by Colonel Melchett, who approached with visible reluctance. His usual military bearing seemed diminished by whatever internal struggle he was fighting. "Miss Marple," he began carefully, "I find myself in a rather delicate position. There are matters that perhaps should be brought to light, given the circumstances." Miss Marple's gentle encouragement seemed to unlock his resolve. "Mrs. Price-Ridley came to see me yesterday evening, quite distressed. It seems Mrs. Bantry had been making rather pointed comments about old secrets that were better left buried. There was a matter from years past, her late husband's involvement in some questionable business dealings. Nothing criminal, you understand, but something that could have caused considerable social embarrassment. And Mrs. Bantry felt these matters should be acknowledged. In her well-meaning but sometimes tactless way, yes. She believed in clearing the air, regardless of the consequences to others' reputations." Colonel Melchett's discomfort was evident. Mrs. Price-Ridley was terrified of exposure. She spoke of how Mrs. Bantry always managed to dig up things that were better forgotten. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind assembling the pieces with the methodical precision of her needlework. The embroidered initials on the damask square, the compact with its telltale bitter residue, the thread caught on the witness box rail, Mrs. Price-Ridley's frantic behavior, all pointed toward someone who had planned this afternoon's events with domestic precision rather than criminal expertise. Meanwhile, Inspector Slack emerged from his makeshift office, still confident in his case. "The evidence against Mrs. Clement remains solid," he announced to Dr. Haydock. access to poison, opportunity, and nervous behavior throughout the afternoon. Miss Marple observed how this declaration seemed to provide relief to several villagers, their shoulders relaxing as suspicion appeared to settle elsewhere. Yet Mrs. Price-Ridley's reaction was quite different, a tightening around her eyes that spoke of fear rather than relief. "Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, "I wonder if you might examine the compact young Lucy discovered. In my experience, such personal items often tell interesting stories about their owner's recent activities." The suggestion hung in the evening air like incense, heavy with implication. Mrs. Price-Ridley's face went quite pale, while Lucy's hand moved protectively to her pocket. The afternoon's mock trial had indeed become something far more serious, and Miss Marple suspected the most important revelations were yet to come. In her long experience with human nature, the most dangerous criminals were often those who applied their most respectable skills to the most desperate purposes. Inspector Slack accepted the compact with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to cataloguing evidence, though his expression suggested he considered it merely another piece in an already completed puzzle. The gold case caught the hall's fading light as he turned it over, revealing the delicate engraving that confirmed its ownership. "Initials PRs on the back," he observed matter-of-factly. "Mrs. Price-Ridley, this appears to be yours." Mrs. Price-Ridley's response was immediate and flustered. "Indeed it is, Inspector. I must have dropped it during all the dreadful confusion when poor Mrs. Bantry collapsed. Such a shock makes one quite careless with personal belongings." Her voice carried a forced lightness that seemed to require considerable effort to maintain. Dr. Haydock stepped forward with professional interest. "Inspector, given the circumstances, perhaps I might examine it briefly. Any object found near the victim could prove significant." He accepted the compact with careful hands, opening it to reveal the powder puff thick with cosmetics and, along the interior hinge, a smear that had darkened as if the compact had been closed hastily over something damp. The bitter almond scent rose faintly but unmistakably from within, causing Dr. Haydock's expression to grow grave. "Inspector, this compact shows clear signs of contamination. The powder itself appears to have been deliberately treated with cyanide." A ripple of shock ran through the assembled villagers, while Mrs. Price-Ridley swayed visibly. "But that's quite impossible," she protested weakly. "I use that compact daily. If it contained poison, surely I would have noticed something amiss." Miss Marple's gentle voice cut through the confusion with quiet precision. "Not necessarily, dear. A careful person might apply the contaminated powder to something else entirely. Perhaps the rim of a crystal glass, for instance." The implications settled over the hall like evening mist. Inspector Slack's confidence in his case began to show the first hairline cracks as he examined the compact more closely, noting how the contamination was localized to one specific area where powder might be scraped away with a fingernail. Before he could pursue this line of inquiry further, the young constable returned from his errand to Mrs. Clement's cottage, breathless with discovery. "Inspector, sir, we found this hidden in Mrs. Clement's sewing basket." He produced a small, leather-bound diary, its pages filled with neat, meticulous handwriting. Inspector Slack's attention immediately shifted to this new evidence, his relief at finding something that supported his original theory, evident in his eager examination of the journal's contents. "Listen to this," he announced, his voice carrying across the hushed hall. He read aloud several entries detailing Mrs. Clement's growing resentment toward Mrs. Bantry's well-meaning but often overbearing interference in village affairs. The diary painted a picture of wounded pride and simmering resentment, culminating in an entry from the previous week that seemed to border on threat. The assembled villagers murmured their shock and dismay, their earlier unease now replaced by the comfort of what appeared to be definitive proof of Mrs. Clement's guilt. "There we have it," Inspector Slack declared with renewed confidence. "Motive, means, and opportunity, all clearly established. Mrs. Clement's access to poison through her work at the chemist's, combined with this documented grudge against Mrs. Bantry, provides a complete picture of premeditated murder. Dr. Haydock nodded slowly, though his eyes remained troubled. The diary entries are certainly compelling, Inspector, though I must say the contaminated compact raises interesting questions about method. Miss Marple continued her gentle knitting, her needles moving with their familiar rhythm, while her mild blue eyes observed the proceedings with careful attention. Something about the diary's convenient discovery and perfectly articulated grievances troubled her deeply. In her long experience, people rarely documented their murderous intentions with such literary precision, particularly not someone as naturally discreet as Mrs. Clement. Moreover, the compact's contamination suggested a level of domestic planning that seemed inconsistent with the chemist's sharp theory. The careful application of poison to cosmetics spoke of someone intimately familiar with feminine habits and routines, someone who understood exactly how and when such a method would prove effective. Mrs. Price-Ridley had grown increasingly pale during these revelations, her earlier protests about the compact's contamination now seeming hollow in light of the physical evidence. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her remaining glove, and Miss Marple noticed how the woman's eyes kept darting between the compact in Dr. Haydock's hands and the diary in Inspector Slack's possession. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "I wonder if you might consider the timing of these discoveries. The compact was found immediately after Mrs. Bantry's death, while the diary was located only after Mrs. Clement's arrest. In my experience, evidence that appears so conveniently often deserves the closest scrutiny." Colonel Melchett, who had been listening with growing discomfort, cleared his throat nervously. "Surely, Miss Marple, you're not suggesting the diary was planted. Mrs. Clement's own handwriting is unmistakable." "Oh, I'm certain the handwriting is genuine," Miss Marple replied with her characteristic mildness. "But people often write things they never intend to act upon, particularly when they're feeling frustrated or misunderstood. The question is whether these entries represent actual murderous intent or simply the natural human tendency to express private grievances in one's diary." The evening shadows had deepened considerably, and the hall's atmosphere remained heavy with unresolved tension. Inspector Slack, despite his renewed confidence in the diary evidence, found himself troubled by the compact's implications and Miss Marple's gentle questioning. The afternoon's mock trial had revealed layers of deception and motive that extended far beyond his initial assessment, and he was beginning to suspect that the true complexity of the case was only now becoming apparent. As the villagers continued their nervous discussions, Miss Marple reflected on the careful domestic precision required to contaminate a powder compact effectively. Such knowledge spoke of someone deeply familiar with feminine routines and social customs, someone who understood that a lady's cosmetics were both intimate and trusted. The real murderer, she suspected, was still among them, hidden behind a facade of shocked innocence while watching their carefully constructed deception unfold exactly as planned. The evening shadows had deepened considerably, casting long fingers of darkness across the village hall as Inspector Slack organized his evidence with methodical precision. Miss Marple remained in her corner chair, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm while her mild blue eyes continued their careful observations. The departure of most villagers had created a more intimate atmosphere, one where careful conversations might yield the truths that larger gatherings often concealed. Dr. Haydock positioned himself near the window, using the last natural light to conduct a more thorough examination of the contaminated compact. His medical training served him well as he carefully scraped samples from the interior, noting patterns that spoke of deliberate rather than accidental contamination. "Inspector," he called quietly, "I believe I've discovered something rather significant. The powder shows clear finger marks where someone deliberately mixed cyanide into the cosmetics using bare hands. More interesting still, there are traces of what appears to be expensive hand cream mixed with the poison." This observation caused Mrs. Price-Ridley to unconsciously adjust her gloves, a gesture that Miss Marple noted with considerable interest. The woman's hands had always been her pride, soft and white from years of careful maintenance with costly creams and weekly attention from the village manicurist. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the careful movements of someone who had reached important conclusions. She approached Mrs. Price-Ridley with her characteristic gentle smile, settling into the adjacent chair as if seeking nothing more than pleasant conversation. "Such a dreadful business, isn't it, dear?" she began, her voice soft and sympathetic. "Poor Dolly. Always so particular about her things, her silver, her linens, even the way she took that first ceremonial sip of cordial." Mrs. Price-Ridley started slightly, her fan pausing mid-gesture. "Indeed, Miss Marple, a tragedy beyond comprehension." "Yes, it makes one think about habits, doesn't it?" Miss Marple continued with gentle persistence. "How well we come to know each other's little ways over the years. Dolly's ritual with her cordial, for instance, always that delicate first sip, held so carefully before taking a proper drink. Such refinement." She paused, her mild eyes twinkling with something that might have been mere curiosity. "And always so careful not to leave rings on furniture. That little damask square was such a thoughtful touch, so very precise in its placement." Mrs. Price-Ridley's breathing became slightly more rapid. "Lucy is a good girl, always trying to please. I'm sure she simply wanted everything to look presentable." "Oh, I'm certain she did," Miss Marple agreed warmly, though I couldn't help noticing that the damask itself was rather fine quality. Not the usual village hall fare, surely. More like something from a personal collection with those lovely embroidered initials. Her voice remained conversational, but her eyes were watchful. "PR, such beautiful needlework. The sort that speaks of years of careful domestic training." A faint flush crept up Mrs. Price-Ridley's neck, and Miss Marple observed how her hands trembled almost imperceptibly. "One does try to maintain standards, even for amateur theatricals. Dolly deserved the very best presentation." "She did notice everything, didn't she?" Miss Marple mused, her gaze drifting toward the compact that Dr. Haydock continued to examine. "Always so particular about appearances. I remember how carefully she powdered her nose. Such gentle dabbing motions, never vigorous. So different from those who might be more energetic in their cosmetic applications." Mrs. Price-Ridley's hand moved instinctively toward her face, and Miss Marple noticed the faint trace of powder that still clung near the corner of her mouth. Evidence of recent nervous touching. The unraveling thread on her glove seemed to mirror her increasingly frayed composure. "It does make one wonder," Miss Marple continued with deceptive mildness, "how someone might manage to apply poison to cosmetics so precisely that only a small amount would transfer, perhaps to the rim of a crystal glass, without harming themselves. Such delicate work would require considerable skill, the sort one develops through years of fine needlework, perhaps." Inspector Slack, who had been listening with growing attention, stepped forward. "Mrs. Price-Ridley, Dr. Haydock's examination of your compact shows clear evidence of deliberate contamination. The pattern suggests someone with intimate knowledge of how such cosmetics are used." Mrs. Price-Ridley's carefully maintained composure finally began to crack. "I don't understand what you're suggesting. This is all terribly upsetting." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but gained a subtle firmness. "My dear, I think you understand perfectly well. The damask squares in the hall's linen cupboard bear your initials. Your compact was contaminated with the same poison that killed Mrs. Bantry. The thread caught on the witness box matches your glove's unraveling crochet work." She paused, allowing these facts to settle. "And then there's the matter of Mrs. Clement's diary, discovered so conveniently after her arrest. The diary proves Mrs. Clement's guilt," Mrs. Price-Ridley protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Does it?" Miss Marple asked mildly. Or does it prove that someone with access to Mrs. Clement's cottage and knowledge of her handwriting wished to create that impression? Someone who might have offered to help organize papers while Mrs. Clement was at the shops? Dr. Haydock looked up from his examination with grim certainty. The contamination pattern on this compact is quite deliberate. Someone used their finger to mix cyanide into specific areas of the powder, knowing exactly how it would be transferred during use. The accumulated evidence seemed to press down upon Mrs. Price-Ridley like a physical weight. Her breathing became labored, and her face had gone quite pale. She was going to ruin everything, she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple prompted gently. The dam burst with sudden, terrible completeness. 20 years I've built my reputation in this village. 20 years of careful respectability, and she was going to destroy it all with her meddling righteousness. Mrs. Price-Ridley's voice rose with desperate fury. She discovered the truth about Harold's business dealings, the missing funds, the forged documents. She claimed it was water under the bridge, but insisted on clearing the air for the good of the community. Inspector Slack stepped forward, his voice carrying official weight. Mrs. Price-Ridley, I must caution you that anything you say may be used in evidence. But the confession continued to pour forth like water through a broken dam. She had no understanding of what such revelations would do to my position here. I've worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let her destroy everything with her insufferable honesty. Her laugh held no humor. It seemed so simple. I knew her habits perfectly. That careful first sip, always the same grateful smile. I merely had to ensure the poison was exactly where she would encounter it. And Mrs. Clement's diary? Dr. Haydock asked quietly. Poor, trusting Mrs. Clement. So grateful when I offered to help organize her papers yesterday. It was quite easy to add entries in her own hand. She'd written similar complaints often enough that copying her style presented no difficulty. Mrs. Price-Ridley's voice had taken on an almost dreamy quality, as if she were describing someone else's actions. Miss Marple nodded with sad understanding. The domestic precision of it all. Using your own compact to apply the poison, bringing your finest damask squares to ensure proper presentation. Even the careful timing of when the contaminated glass would be placed. You turned the very skills that made you a respected member of the community into instruments of murder. Inspector Slack moved forward with handcuffs at the ready, while the remaining villagers watched in stunned silence as their pillar of respectability revealed herself to be something far more dangerous. The afternoon's mock trial had indeed become something terrifyingly real, and justice would now follow its proper course. Dr. Haydock shook his head at the revelation, marveling at how domestic skills and social position had nearly resulted in an innocent woman's conviction. Miss Marple resumed her knitting with quiet satisfaction, another puzzle solved through patient observation of human nature's capacity for both respectability and ruthless self-preservation. The evening shadows continued to deepen as Mrs. Price-Ridley was led away, her carefully constructed facade finally crumbling entirely. The village hall, which had hosted an afternoon of playful justice, had witnessed something far more serious. The exposure of how even the most respectable surfaces could conceal the darkest of human motivations. The heavy silence that followed Mrs. Price-Ridley's departure seemed to settle into the very walls of the village hall, broken only by the distant sound of Inspector Slack's motor car disappearing into the gathering darkness. The festive bunting that had welcomed the afternoon's mock trial now hung like a reproach, its cheerful colors grotesque against the weight of genuine tragedy that had replaced theatrical entertainment. Miss Marple remained in her corner chair, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm while her mild blue eyes surveyed the remaining villagers with compassionate understanding. Young Lucy Iles-Barrow sat in stunned silence, her face pale as parchment as the full implications of her unwitting role settled over her like a shroud. "I helped her," Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible in the oppressive quiet. When she insisted on the special Damask squares, when she told me to make everything proper for Mrs. Bantry, I thought she was simply being kind. I never imagined I was helping to arrange a murder scene. Dr. Haydock, still holding the contaminated compact wrapped carefully in his handkerchief, shook his head with professional dismay. The precision of it troubles me most. She turned domestic. Knowledge into a weapon, using our very trust in her respectability as camouflage for calculated evil. Inspector Slack, his earlier confidence replaced by thoughtful humility, approached Miss Marple with genuine respect. I must ask, Miss Marple, you saw through it all, didn't you? While I was pursuing the obvious suspect, you were seeing something entirely different. Would you mind explaining how you reached your conclusions? Miss Marple set down her knitting with careful precision, her expression gentle but serious. It was simply a matter of observing the small details that people often overlook, Inspector. Like a pattern in fine lace, once you see the first stitch, the rest begins to reveal itself. She began with the seemingly innocent damask square. The village hall's usual linen is quite utilitarian. Coarse cotton, often mended. But the square beneath Mrs. Bantry's glass was fine Irish damask, folded with domestic precision and bearing the faint scent of lavender sachets. Such an item would never be part of the hall's regular supplies. Someone had brought it specifically, and when I examined the linen cupboard later, I found matching squares embroidered with the initials PR. Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. And the compact itself provided the method. Precisely. The contamination pattern showed finger marks and traces of expensive hand cream, not a chemist's casual handling, but a lady's careful application. Mrs. Price-Ridley had contaminated her own cosmetics, knowing she could transfer the poison to Mrs. Bantry's glass rim while appearing to make helpful adjustments to the witness stand. Colonel Melchett, who had remained silent throughout the confession, finally spoke with visible disillusionment. The thread caught on the witness box rail. That came from her glove? Indeed. It matched the unraveling crochet work perfectly. She had leaned very close to position everything precisely, close enough for the fabric to catch on a splinter. Such attention to detail spoke of someone who understood domestic arrangements intimately. Inspector Slack's expression grew increasingly grave. And Mrs. Clement's diary? That was deliberate misdirection? Miss Marple's voice carried the sadness of someone who had witnessed such betrayals before. Mrs. Price-Ridley knew Mrs. Clement's handwriting well enough to add damning entries, and she understood the woman's genuine but minor frustrations well enough to make them appear murderous. She had offered to help organize papers just the day before, providing perfect opportunity. The assembled villagers absorbed these revelations with varying degrees of shock and understanding. Lucy's shoulders sagged with the weight of her inadvertent complicity, while Colonel Melchett struggled visibly with the destruction of his faith in social respectability. But why? Lucy asked plaintively. Why would she do such a terrible thing? Miss Marple's expression grew infinitely compassionate. Human. Nature, my dear. Mrs. Price-Ridley had spent 20 years building her reputation as the village's moral authority. When Mrs. Bantry threatened to reveal her late husband's questionable business dealings, not from malice, but from her well-meaning belief in clearing the air, Mrs. Price-Ridley saw her entire carefully constructed world crumbling. Dr. Haydock began organizing his medical bag with methodical movements, seeking comfort in familiar routine. She used her knowledge of village life, her understanding of everyone's habits and weaknesses, as weapons. Even her respectability became a tool for murder. Miss Marple folded her knitting with thoughtful precision. In my experience, Inspector, the most dangerous people are often those who have learned to use society's expectations as camouflage for their darker impulses. Mrs. Price-Ridley's mistake was in being too thorough. Real crimes are usually messier, more chaotic. This one had the precision of someone who planned every detail to ensure someone else would bear the consequences. As the remaining villagers began to disperse into the evening darkness, Each carrying their own burden of disillusionment, Miss Marple reflected on the afternoon's harsh lessons. The mock trial had become terrifyingly real, revealing not only a murderer's calculated evil, but also the dangerous comfort of obvious explanations and the masks that respectability could provide for the darkest human motivations. The village hall stood nearly empty now, its festive decorations seeming grotesquely inappropriate in the aftermath of murder and deception. Justice had been served, but at the cost of innocence, both Mrs. Clement's near conviction and the community's faith in the reliability of appearances. In St. Mary Mead, nothing would ever seem quite as simple again. The silence that settled over the village hall carried the weight of shattered illusions, broken only by the methodical sounds of Inspector Slack organizing his evidence with newfound humility. The festive bunting that had welcomed the afternoon's mock trial now seemed grotesquely inappropriate, its cheerful colors a mockery of the genuine tragedy that had replaced theatrical entertainment. Miss Marple remained in her corner chair, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm while her mild blue eyes observed the remaining villagers with compassionate understanding. The departure of Mrs. Price-Ridley had created a vacuum that seemed to draw out confessions and reflections like air from a punctured balloon. Inspector Slack approached her with visible reluctance, his earlier confidence replaced by the careful humility of someone who had learned an important lesson about the dangers of obvious conclusions. "Miss Marple, I owe you more than gratitude. I was prepared to see Mrs. Clement convicted based on what seemed like overwhelming evidence. Your patience with my assumptions prevented a terrible miscarriage of justice." "One must always look beneath the surface, Inspector," Miss Marple replied gently. Mrs. Price-Ridley understood that people prefer comfortable explanations to uncomfortable truths. She nearly succeeded because she gave everyone exactly what they expected to find, a nervous woman with access to poison and documented grievances. Dr. Haydock secured the contaminated compact in his medical bag with careful precision, his movements reflecting the gravity of evidence that had nearly condemned an innocent woman. "The sophistication of it troubles me most. She turned domestic knowledge into a weapon, using our very trust in her respectability as camouflage for calculated murder." Young Lucy Barrow sat pale and shaken, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron as the full implications of her unwitting complicity settled over her. "I helped arrange the murder scene," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "When she insisted on the special damask squares, when she told me to make everything proper, I thought she was simply being kind to Mrs. Bantry." Miss Marple's expression grew infinitely gentle. "My dear child, evil often succeeds by enlisting the cooperation of good people who have no idea what they're truly helping to accomplish. Your kindness was used against you, but that doesn't make you culpable for another's wickedness." Colonel Melchett, who had withdrawn to a corner during Mrs. Price-Ridley's confession, finally spoke with the voice of someone whose faith in social order had been profoundly shaken. 15 years I've known Millicent Price-Ridley. She organized charity drives, led committees, embodied everything we thought respectable about village life. How does one reconcile such public virtue with such private calculation? "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested thoughtfully, "that's precisely why she was so dangerous. People who build their entire identity around public virtue often develop a desperate need to protect that image at any cost. When Mrs. Bantry threatened to reveal uncomfortable truths, Mrs. Price-Ridley saw not just embarrassment, but the complete destruction of everything she had worked to become." Inspector Slack began extinguishing the hall's gas lamps with methodical care, each flame's departure casting deeper shadows across the scene of the afternoon's tragedy. "The inquest will be tomorrow morning," he announced. "Dr. Haydock will testify to the medical evidence, and I'll present the physical proof. Miss Marple, would you be willing to explain your observations about the domestic details that revealed the truth?" "If it would be helpful, Inspector, though I suspect the case is quite clear now that we understand the real sequence of events." As they prepared to leave the hall, Miss Marple paused beside the refreshment table where Mrs. Bantry's elderflower cordial still sat in its crystal decanter, untouched and innocent. The sight brought profound sadness to her gentle features. Poor Dolly. Her only crime was believing that truth was always preferable to comfortable deception, such a dangerous philosophy when people have so much to hide. The evening air outside carried the familiar scents of St. Mary Mead, roses and honeysuckle, wood smoke from cottage chimneys, the green smell of gardens settling into dusk. Yet something had changed irrevocably in the village's atmosphere. The comfortable certainties that had once made neighbors feel safe with one another had been replaced by a new wariness, a recognition that even the most respectable facades could conceal the darkest motivations. Miss Marple walked slowly through the quiet streets, reflecting on the eternal struggle between appearance and reality. In her long experience, the most important battles were often fought not with weapons, but with careful observation, patient deduction, and the courage to speak uncomfortable truths when comfortable lies would have been far easier to accept. The mock trial had become terrifyingly real, but justice, delayed and nearly derailed though it had been, would ultimately prevail. Tomorrow's inquest would provide formal closure, but the real resolution lay in understanding how respectability itself could become a mask for evil, and how the most dangerous criminals were often those who had learned to make their virtues serve their vices. The morning brought a gentle mist that curled along the lanes of St. Mary Mead, softening the harsh edges that yesterday's revelations had carved into familiar faces. The village hall, stripped of its festive bunting, wore the sober dignity appropriate for an inquest, though the cheerful decorations seemed to linger in memory, like echoes of innocence lost. Miss Marple sat quietly near the back, her knitting bag resting at her feet. Even she felt it improper to work her needles, while justice had its formal say. The proceedings unfolded with measured precision, each piece of evidence presented like careful stitches in a pattern that revealed truth through accumulated detail. Dr. Haydock testified first, his medical authority lending weight to the clinical facts. He described the rapid onset of cyanide poisoning, the bitter almond scent that had lingered faintly in the air, and most significantly, the contaminated compact that had served as the murder weapon. The coroner examined the evidence with grave attention, noting how the poison had been deliberately applied to specific areas where it would transfer to a glass rim during normal cosmetic use. Inspector Slack presented the physical evidence methodically, his earlier overconfidence replaced by careful attention to detail. The embroidered damask squares bearing Mrs. Price-Ridley's initials, the thread caught on the witness box rail, the forged diary entries. Each element painted a picture of domestic precision turned to deadly purpose. When he spoke of Mrs. Clement's near conviction, his voice carried the weight of a man who had learned difficult lessons about the dangers of obvious conclusions. Young Lucy Isles Barrow rose with trembling dignity to describe her unwitting role in the crime's preparation. Her testimony about the special damask squares and careful glass placement revealed how innocence could be manipulated by calculated evil. The girl's obvious distress moved the assembled villagers, who began to understand how completely they had all been deceived. When Miss Marple was called to explain her observations, she spoke with gentle clarity about the small details that had revealed the truth. "It reminded me of a piece of embroidery I once examined," she said thoughtfully. From a distance, it appeared quite lovely and perfectly symmetrical. But closer inspection revealed a tiny, deliberate flaw, a stitch placed just wrong enough to draw attention away from a much larger error hidden elsewhere in the pattern. Mrs. Price-Ridley's entire respectability was such a pattern, designed to conceal something far more sinister beneath its perfect surface. The coroner's verdict surprised no one. Murder by Mrs. Millicent Price-Ridley, with sufficient evidence to commit her for trial. Mrs. Clement, formerly cleared of all suspicion, sat pale but dignified in the front row, her ordeal visible in every line of her face, yet her spirit unbroken by the injustice she had narrowly escaped. After the proceedings concluded, Inspector Slack lingered by the hall steps, his eyes fixed on stones worn smooth by generations of feet. Miss Marple joined him, and for a time they both attended to the ordinary sounds of village life resuming its rhythm. The rattle of a milk cart, a calling blackbird, the familiar creak of bicycle chains. "I was on trial yesterday," he said finally, not looking at her. "No judge, no jury, only the scales inside one's own conscience. I had all the right answers to the wrong questions." Miss Marple's expression grew infinitely gentle. "One learns, Inspector. Human nature is rarely tidy, and it seldom keeps its poison in the cabinet where one expects to find it. Mrs. Price-Ridley understood that the most convincing deceptions don't rely on grand lies, but on subtle manipulations of familiar truths." He nodded slowly, accepting her mild correction as the favor it was intended to be. "If it had depended on me alone, Mrs. Clement would be facing the gallows this morning while the real murderer walked free." "The murder put you on trial, Inspector," Miss Marple replied with quiet wisdom. "You passed when it truly mattered." In the days that followed, St. Mary Mead struggled to find its footing. The comfortable certainties that had once made neighbors feel safe with one another had been replaced by a new wariness, a recognition that even the most respectable facades could conceal the darkest motivations. Lucy Iles Barrow, though absolved of blame, carried the quiet burden of knowing how easily good intentions could be exploited by evil ones. Colonel Melchett found his faith in social respectability profoundly shaken, while Mrs. Clement resumed her quiet life with the dignity of someone who had faced injustice and emerged vindicated. The village would heal, Miss Marple knew, as all villages eventually did. The shock would fade, replaced by a new layer of cautionary folklore whispered over tea. Life would resume its familiar rhythms, church bells would ring, committee meetings would continue, gardens would bloom again in spring. But an innocence had been lost, a collective naivety about the true depths of human capacity for both good and evil. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her garden cottage, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm as she worked on the pale blue jumper that had occupied her hands during yesterday's tragic events. Through her window, she could see lights beginning to twinkle in cottage windows as St. Mary Mead settled into its evening routine, forever changed but enduring. A robin hopped along her garden path, found a crumb, and flew away with simple purpose. Miss Marple smiled at the sight, reflecting on how life continued its patient course despite human complications. The world remained full of intricate patterns, some beautiful, some deceiving, but all revealing their secrets to those willing to observe with patience and understanding. Her needles clicked softly in the gathering dusk, each stitch as measured and precise as the deductions that had revealed truth beneath comfortable deceptions. In her long experience with human nature, justice might sometimes be delayed or nearly derailed, but it ultimately prevailed when good people had the courage to look beyond appearances and speak uncomfortable truth. The mock trial was over, but the real lessons about the complexity of human nature would endure long after the courthouse drama had faded into village memory. Miss Marple continued her knitting with quiet satisfaction, another puzzle solved through patient observation of the eternal mystery that was the human heart.